Do you find that your coloured pencil drawings are looking grainy or crayon-like? Are you wanting your drawings to look smoother? In this video, I'll go through 5 different ways to blend coloured pencil to make your colours look smooth and vibrant. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make art tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. For the first 4 techniques, I'll be using Clairefontaine pastel mat as the surface, but you can use a smooth watercolour paper for these 4 techniques as well. And these aren't the only 2 types of papers you can use for coloured pencil, but these are the surfaces that I have used, so I know that they work. Whichever paper that you choose, I'd recommend trialling these techniques on the type of paper you're using before you go into your project, as each paper will give a slightly different result. So the first technique is light layers, and for this one I would recommend using a harder pencil like the Faber-Castell Polychromos or the Caran d'Ache Luminance, just because you definitely need a sharper pencil for this one and it's easier to get a fine point with a harder lead. This technique is the most time consuming out of all of the 5 techniques today, just because you have to spend so much time adding all of the layers. With this technique, you got to make sure that you're not pressing too hard in the first few layers, and this is because you'll need to be able to add more layers on top. And a good tip if you are pressing really hard like I'm doing here is to try and hold your pencil further down, and that way you're pretty much forced to glide over the paper instead. And the reason that you want to work in many light layers instead of pushing too hard in the beginning to get the saturation straight away is because you need to be able to see the colors underneath to make it look more realistic. For example, if you're working on portraiture with skin, you need to be able to see those underlying colors of the skin, because if you push really hard in the beginning, you're going to get one flat color throughout and it's going to look more like a coloring piece than a realistic portrait. This is by far the most time-consuming technique out of the 5 today, and the reason is that you need to be really careful with each layer because your pencil strokes may show through on the last layer, so you really need to take the time to make sure you're going in tiny little circles or ovals and overlapping slightly over each pencil stroke that you do so that you're not creating any harsh lines that will show through in the final layer. And you need to make sure that your pencil is sharp at all times during this process. And the reason is because the tooth of the paper is like having hills and valleys. So when your pencil is blunt, it's only just going to skim across the top of the hills, meaning the valleys will stay white. And that means you'll see those little tiny white dots showing through on the paper. So just make sure that your pencil is sharp at all times to be able to get into those little valleys. Out of the 5 techniques today, this technique I find still leaves the pencil looking a little bit rough. If you stand back and look at your piece from a normal viewing distance, it looks quite nice and smooth, but I find that for the amount of time that it takes to complete layering this way, it doesn't look as smooth as some other techniques. The second technique is burnishing, and I find that with this technique it works a little bit better when you use the wax-based pencils, so like the Caran d'Ache Luminance or the Prismacolor Premiere or Derwent Drawing. And for this technique, just make sure that you have a few layers down first and you use this burnishing technique on the final layer. So just keep in mind that once you've burnished, it's a little bit hard to add any more color on top. So make sure that you've got all the colors that you need down on your piece of paper first. And so with this technique, you're basically pushing the pigment into the tooth of the paper. So you're pressing really quite hard to do this. And I found that if you're working on quite a large piece, it can actually make your hands quite sore in the end because of how hard you're pushing into the paper with the pencil. So this technique can look really smooth in the end, and that's because you're using the pencil to basically push the pigment into each other and blend the pigment that way. The one thing that I'm not a fan of with this technique, which is why I don't really use it that often, is because it can make the paper look really shiny in different light. The third technique is by using colourless blenders, and this one you start out the exact same way as the first 2, where you layer quite a lot of layers down first, and then I use the Caran d'Ache Luminance colourless blender, but most brands have their own colourless blender that you can use. So these colourless blenders are basically just the binding materials that they use in their pencils themselves without any pigment in it. So the idea is that you have all your layers down first and then you use this colourless blender to burnish the colours together to make them smooth, kind of like the burnishing technique, but this way you're not adding any extra pigment on top, so it doesn't alter the colours underneath. I find that with this technique it's a little bit easier to apply less pressure with the colourless blender and then apply a few more colours on top and then go back in with the colourless blender again to blend it out, but you can use it the exact same way as the burnishing technique. You just got to make sure that you have enough pigment on your paper first. So I usually find that you need quite a lot more layers with this technique than you do with the burnishing technique, because you're not adding any more pigment on top, which means you need more pigment down first to be able to blend it into each other. Otherwise there's not really anything to blend together. The fourth technique is by using solvent, or odourless mineral spirits, or OMS for short. This is my favourite technique. It's probably the most versatile out of the 5. You can pretty much use it on any surface that you like. I found that this is probably the quickest way to blend coloured pencil, especially if you're using the Clairefontaine pastel matte paper. It really blends out quite smoothly and vibrant from the first time that you use the OMS. So I'm using the Art Spectrum odourless solvent. It doesn't really matter what brand you use as long as it's an artist grade solvent. And I usually put it into a little container like this, which has a lid, so that when I'm not using it I can put the lid on, because it is toxic. So I usually apply it using a paintbrush, but you can also use cotton tips if you don't have a spare paintbrush lying around. So all you need to do is dip your paintbrush in and then dab off any excess so that you're not saturating your paper. It can cause damage to your paper if you make it a little bit too wet. And the biggest tip is to make sure that you've got enough layers on your paper before you go in with the OMS. If you only have one light layer of coloured pencil down, you'll find that when you try and blend it out, there's nothing for the solvent to actually blend together. It kind of just, it doesn't make it smooth, it just leaves it looking grainy and gritty, and that's usually the main problem that people have when using solvent, is that they don't have enough layers down on the paper. And even after just blending it out with one layer of solvent, it already looks really smooth. You can actually wait for the OMS to dry after 10 to 15 minutes and go back in with more coloured pencil on top, because the great thing about OMS is that it doesn't damage the tooth of the paper. It blends the coloured pencil into the tooth of the paper, which means that you can add more layers on top, unlike the burnishing technique where it flattens the tooth of the paper, so it's really hard to get more colour on top. And that's also why I prefer the OMS technique over any other technique, because it really is versatile. And with this technique, if you put more coloured pencil on top, you can also blend that with OMS as well, and you can continue doing that in many layers. The fifth technique is powder blender, and this is probably the most interesting. It's by Brush and Pencil, which is by Aliona Nicholson, and it comes in this little container. And the way that you apply it is with these soft tools. It's SOFFT. They're kind of like makeup sponges, but they're a little bit different, and they come in a bunch of different sizes that you can use for different backgrounds and different techniques and things like that. And you'll also need this textured fixative spray to use in between layers, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. So with this product you will need to use a sanded surface, and I'm using ampersand pastel board. In Australia it's really hard to get any of the recommended brands that Aliona and the Brush and Pencil company tell us to use. So if you live in other countries you can use UART or Fisher 400, and there's a bunch of other brands as well if you can get your hands on them. So the way that this works is that you only need 1 or 2 layers of really light pencil on the paper, and it usually works best with oil-based coloured pencils like the polychromos. And with this technique you need to be really light with the pencil, almost like it's just sitting on top of the surface. If you press too hard it just won't blend out smoothly, it'll stay grainy looking. The container that the powder blender comes in is really quite small, and that's because you barely need anything on your tool before you start blending, and it will last a really long time. So don't think that you need to put heaps on your tool to actually make it blend out smoothly. You really don't need much at all. And once you've blended the pencil out with the powder blender, you'll need to go in with the textured fixative in between every layer. And when you go to use this product, make sure that you shake it first for a few minutes. And I'm not exaggerating when I say a few minutes. Actually spend the time to shake it so that the product mixes properly. Make sure that you wait 15 to 20 minutes after you spray onto your surface, just to make sure that it's completely dry before going in with more pencil. So this technique is a lot like oil painting, where you can apply many translucent layers so that the layers underneath can still show through. And the more layers that you add, the smoother and the more vibrant it will look. And with this technique, it's unlimited layers. So the textured fixative actually adds more tooth to the paper, so you can continue adding more and more layers to make it look as vibrant and as saturated as you needed it to be. And if you're using this product, I would highly recommend reading Aliona Nicholson's books. She's got 2 out that explain how you can use this technique really well, especially with portraiture. I could make an entirely separate video explaining all the techniques that you can use with this product. And I just wanted to show you a comparison between the pastel mat with powder blender and the pastel board with powder blender. You really need to use a sanded surface like the ampersand pastel board or UR or Fisher 400 because the pastel mat just doesn't blend out quite as vibrantly. It works to a certain extent, but it really doesn't give you the same effect as what a sanded surface does. If you're interested in more coloured pencil tutorials, check out the playlist on the screen and I'll see you in the next video.